The Signal Tower is simultaneously the most powerful and mysterious area in Little Nightmares 2. We know that the Signal Tower has the ability to corrupt the entire Pale City, but without a bit of digging, little else is known about it. In this video, I'm going to offer some theories, ideas, and things you might have missed in the Signal Tower area of Little Nightmares 2. So, spoiler warning as always, if you haven't played all of the games, the comics, the DLCs, everything, there could be spoilers for any of them in this video. If you want to avoid spoilers, this is your one warning. Otherwise, let's get into the video. The Signal Tower is the final area in Little Nightmares 2, and aside from being the most crazy, it is also the most mysterious. But what is actually going on here? What dark secrets may the Signal Tower be hiding? The first and perhaps most obvious thing about the Signal Tower is that it defies the laws of physics. As previously discussed in my timeline video, time and space in the Signal Tower don't work properly. Doors lead you to nowhere, being infinite loops, and the staircases just seem a little bit odd. Those staircases could actually be a reference to the Penrose Staircase, or otherwise known, the Impossible Stairs. Originally created by Oscar Rutesvard, and I hope I said that correctly, the Impossible Staircase was a 3D visual illusion which just doesn't make sense. The staircase feeds into itself, creating an infinite loop, not unlike the infinite loop many theorize Mono is now trapped in. The Signal Tower reminds me of the Impossible Staircase in so many ways, and while the infinite loop in the game comes in the form of doorways and not infinite stairs, the tone and message remains similar. It's an impossible tower, one that shouldn't be able to exist in the way that it does. But we don't stop digging there, do we? No, not on this channel. You see, Oscar Rutesvard was Swedish. Tarsier Studios are also a Swedish company. It makes sense that they wanted to put a little bit of their country's culture and history into the game. But looking at Little Nightmares and then at Oscar's work, you can actually start to see a lot of similarities, maybe even inspirations. Oscar created several impossible figures throughout his time, but all of them are presented in parallel, also known as the Japanese perspective. The Japanese perspective, also known as the one-point perspective, is quite complicated, but I'll do my best to explain this even though I'm not an expert. The one-point perspective is where all parallel lines remain parallel and do not meet at points of visual convergence. The best way to describe this is if we look at this picture of these train tracks, you can see that everything in this image converges into one point at the end of the image. That's the Japanese perspective. What's interesting about the Japanese perspective is that often size and proportions don't seem to be quite perfect. It's not like a photograph, the perspective here is a little bit off, and we can see this come through in the game of Little Nightmares. We already looked at the Pale City and noted that there are a bunch of clues that point to this being a reference to a Japanese city, and also Bandai Namco, the publishers of Little Nightmares and now the IP holders, they are also Japanese. What's interesting to note as well is that Oscar's work was often done on Japanese rice paper, and often with Japanese coloured chalk. But we're not done yet. Oh no. Oscar was known as being dyslexic, something we can easily see represented in the entire game. Dyslexia is a learning disorder stemming from difficulties with recognizing speech sounds and how they relate to words. The characters or symbols around the Pale City, while they look vaguely Japanese, are actually nonsense. School children with dyslexia often show symptoms such as learning to talk later than other children, or confusing words that sound alike, maybe even reversing sounds. If we think about the school children in Little Nightmares 2, they are singing the same song that we see in the TV in Little Nightmares 1, which some people call the Veronica song. The tune is identical, however the words have changed. I originally thought the developers changed the wording to confuse us, but it's possible that the porcelain children or bullies are actually mispronouncing the song entirely. Oscar had one more problem though, and this one ties in with Little Nightmares just so well. He had difficulties in estimating the distance and the size of objects. This could be the best explanation yet as to why the world seems far too large for Mono 6 and the other comic children. It could be a reference to how Oscar saw the world, a very different way to how we see it. So at this point, I am convinced that Oscar Rutesvard is at least being referenced here, but this could also give us a clue about the world of Little Nightmares in general. It could all be an illusion. Going back to the impossible shapes from earlier, the impossible triangle is just that. It's impossible. Except, it's not impossible at all. In fact, it is entirely possible with just a little bit of creativity. If you look at this, you can see that the impossible triangle is possible if you create it in a 3D space. The impossibility is all an illusion. Could this be hinting towards the series as a whole? Is it all an illusion, or is our perception responsible for seeing things incorrectly in the first place? So at the very least, we have a very cool reference to a famous Swedish artist, but there is one more possible link to Oscar here that I want to acknowledge. Now this one might just be me going way too far down the rabbit hole, but Oscar Rutherford was born in Stockholm. Stockholm is famous for something else. You will have probably heard of it before: Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome, in the most basic sense, is a phenomenon where a captive begins to care for their captor. In 1973, Jan Erik Olsson and another man held 4 people hostage in a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden. The standoff lasted for 6 days, by the way, but after the hostages were released, they refused to testify against their captors. The captors had formed an emotional bond with their captors. Without digging too far into the psychology of Stockholm Syndrome, we could easily draw a parallel between this and Six's journey. Six has been held captive in Little Nightmares 2 several times and in several different ways. In the literal sense, Six was held captive by the Hunter at the start of the game, and later by the Thin Man and/or Signal Tower at the end of the game. But also, if we look at the metaphorical sense, Six has been held captive by Mono throughout this entire thing. If we theorize that the entire Pale City is held in a time loop or a broken timeline, and we look at evidence from my previous video that Mono is trapping people in his TV realm out of a fear of isolation or loneliness, or as some people have pointed out, monophobia, we can deduce that in this game, Six is the metaphorical captive to Mono. But we could also explain this literally too, since Six gets captured by the Hunter when she is distracted by Mono in the comic, and then she is captured again by the Thin Man because Mono let him out of the room in the TV, so what could this all hint at? Six has Stockholm Syndrome for Mono. Symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome include developing positive feelings for the person holding them captive, maybe even developing negative feelings towards authority figures who think they might be trying to help them get away from their captor, perceiving that their captor's humanity matches their own, and believing that they have the same goals and values. Think about it. Six was held captive in Mono's world, but after a time, Six began to see Mono as an ally. They share the same goals, and look at how the enemies in the game react to Mono. These authority figures, the teacher, the doctor, the hunter, all practically ignore Six and go exclusively for Mono. It's only the Thin Man, aka Mono, that doesn't. We also see that Six is the one that helps Mono to get rid of them. What if all along, this is Six's perception of what is happening? Mono appears to be her saviour, but that is all an illusion, just like the impossible triangle. Six's perspective was wrong all along. Perhaps that is why she drops Mono at the end. She finally realised the truth. Think about it one step further. Mono hides his face just like most bank robbers do. It doesn't seem like something a genuine person would do. What is he hiding? His identity, sure, but why? Maybe because he was the villain all along, even before we and Six knew it. So some pretty awesome inspiration and themes in my opinion, but there is more information we can glean from this area. So in the room where you meet Twisted Sixter, you can see a very prominent figure in the background. Now in a previous video I theorized that it could be the granny from the Little Nightmares DLC in this picture, but there is another possible connection here too. At the start of the game we see Six held captive in the Hunter's basement, and on the wall we see a number of figures with their faces crossed out, which I theorized means that these people are dead. If we look at this one, it appears like someone is falling. Some people think that this is foreshadowing the end of Little Nightmares 2 and that this is Mono falling, which it could be, but I actually think that this is a reference to Very Little Nightmares. At the end of Very Little Nightmares, which is confirmed as a prequel, the girl in the yellow raincoat falls to her death while the Pretender falls with her. We assume she dies because the yellow raincoat floats to the surface without her, which could be the Pretender finally catching her, as we know she makes people disappear when she catches them. So we can theorize that this picture on the wall is the girl in the yellow raincoat. Now what's interesting about this room in the Signal Tower is that it is laid out in a very similar way to this room. Six's bed is on the left, Six is there with her music box, and pictures are on the walls. This one has its face scratched out too, which again implies death. So this picture is a girl who we can assume is dead. We can also theorize that this picture is also a picture of the girl in the yellow raincoat. Same place, same layout, same girl? She's even wearing yellow clothing in this picture too. This would be very interesting since this picture is found in the ladies' quarters, her bedroom in fact. Is it possible that the girl in the yellow raincoat is her daughter? But yet there is another way we can interpret this picture. The girl in the yellow raincoat wasn't the only girl who fell to her death. The Pretender did as well. It would make far more sense for the lady to be related to the pretender. Both have dark magic, the lady can turn people into gnomes, she can fly, and she can also presumably drain people of their life force. The pretender can make people vanish, leaving only their clothes behind, has an inhuman vocal projection, is surrounded by gnomes, and both women seem to cover their faces. The lady with a mask, and the pretender with her hair, which looks like a wig to me if I'm being honest. Is it possible that the two are related? Perhaps the lady sent the pretender to the nest in the first place, maybe to keep her safe from the hungry guests, who we know like to eat children, or maybe even to keep her safe from herself. After all, I have theorized in previous videos that the lady at one point was consuming children directly. This would explain why the lady seems to care for her dolls which the pretender also seems to have a fondness for. The lady does seem to have an element of sadness to her. Is that because she lost her daughter? The nest is also similar to the moor in a lot of ways. Both seem to be killing and consuming people, although in slightly different ways and for different purposes. Both places seem to be turning children into gnomes, and both places have a number of staff members that seem to serve there. It's possible that this is just another facility run by the lady, the moor a facility to consume others, and the nest a facility for children to grow. We could go further into this theory, but this is supposed to be a video about the signal tower, so I will leave this for another video, but this picture that we see in both Little Nightmares games definitely seems to be a large connection. So back to the signal tower, there is one other picture that just didn't sit right with me. In this room we can see a picture of Twisted Six before we meet her. Sure, a little foreshadowing, but there could be more going on here. After Six is taken to the signal tower, she spends at least some time as her normal size and shape. After all, we see her try to escape and she's still small. But less than an hour of game time later, we arrive at the signal tower and Six is huge, twisted and monstrous, not unlike many of the adults we see in this world. So that happened in less than an hour? And there is already a picture of her on the wall here in the signal tower. It's entirely possible that Six has actually spent far longer in here than we think. After all, we know that physics in the signal tower are broken, and it's heavily implied that time is broken in the Pale City area too. I covered that in my timeline video if you haven't already checked it out. So if time here is broken, it is absolutely possible that the hour we spend travelling to the signal tower was much longer for Six. It could have been days, weeks, months, or even years. This would absolutely explain Six's change in posture when we break the music box. It would also explain why Six starts to get hunger pains when she leaves the TV. We see the adults in the world are affected by the hunger, but the children don't seem to be, apart from Six. Perhaps Six is affected by it too, because she's been alive for a lot longer than we think. She might look like a child again, but she's actually a much older Six, reverted to her childlike form by Mono. That would explain her change in posture, it would explain why she is smart enough to recognize Mono for who he is, would explain why Six is the only child affected by the hunger, would explain why she is monstrous like every other adult, and would explain why she seems to no longer be scared or show any kind of remorse like she did at the start of Little Nightmares 2. She grew out of it in her time at the signal tower, a time spent alone and in darkness. If the adults of this world are the nightmares, she is the little nightmare. By now I'm sure at least a few of you want me to talk about the giant eye flesh monster that we see in the signal tower and try to explain it. I think there are two possible ways we can explain this thing. The first is the more literal way. We can very easily piece this together if we look at the Little Nightmares 2 official artwork. The artwork shows a clear progression of the Pale City viewers. They first get twisted and warped by the TV signal, and eventually they are consumed by the TV, and we see them falling into a pile where they all twist and warp together. Makes sense, explains the full sets of clothing that we see lying around the city. If we go by this, we could explain the reason why the eye monster chases Mono. It's still desperate to watch the signal, and Mono is the signal. There is another sad metaphor that we can take from this though. In my previous video, I spoke about how Mono's greatest fear was him being alone, growing up in a city where everyone is lonely, where people only have the TV to keep them company. Well, what if we look at it another way? Mono here is the one being watched, all the eyes are on him, almost like the star of a TV show, or hell, maybe even an influencer or YouTuber. All eyes are on him, but he still doesn't have the meaningful connections. This is often something that a lot of TV stars and more recently content creators have spoken about. They have many fans who watch them through their screens, but very few meaningful connections. Many people describe YouTube as a very lonely job. After all, you spend most of your hours every day behind a computer screen, editing, recording, replying to comments. It doesn't really leave a lot of time for socialization. It's just yet another one of Little Nightmare's very clever metaphors for modern humanity. But there is another way that we can interpret the eye monster. It reminds me of another beast from another lore, the lore of H.P. Lovecraft. Yes, I bet at least a couple of you are yelling at your screens right now. It looks like a Shoggoth. Shoggoths in Lovecraft's lore are servants to the Elder Gods. They are described as being varied in size, but some are described as being massive. They are also described as being able to take many different forms, being able to replicate almost any organ, but often they take the form of a mass of eyes and tentacles. You can see in these images that the Shoggoths can look very similar to the eye monster, but we could delve even deeper into this comparison. We see the bathtub, which looks like it is full of tentacles in a padded cell, madness being a very common theme in Lovecraft's work, along with tentacles. The entire Pale City is also covered in mist, and we could even dig further and go into the King in Yellow, which some people suggest has a lot of similarities to 6, although that one definitely deserves its own video. Either way, there is a possible inspiration or homage here, and while it may just be a coincidence, it is yet just another possible explanation as to how this entire world was twisted this way. So those are just some of the hidden dark secrets of the Signal Tower. If you enjoyed this theory, I have a bunch more on the channel, and more horror gaming content. I plan to make content on Resident Evil Village when that comes out, and more horror games too, so if you want to see more videos like that, or more videos like this one, consider subscribing so you don't miss any. I hope you did enjoy this video, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.